Hey, welcome to Echoes of Deception. Today's pretty special, August 28th, and it's the anniversary of a special day that I lived through many years ago. I want to share some thoughts about this day and its significance. Back in August 28th, 1963, and at that point in time and in history, a deception was revealed. And that deception has echoed forward to this very day. Now, it was a deception that was disclosed to the entire nation. At the time, about 250,000 people heard this message. And I want to share that message with you today again. But before I do that, I want to give it some context in time. I was 2 months away from being 16 years old. That's why I'm called the Geezer, right? I can't sit here and swear to you, nor would I, that I can remember what I was doing that day, what songs I might have been listening to, because you see, the day was August, and that's a summer day, and that's a pretty special time for all kids at that age, and so I don't have a clue what I was doing. But I can tell you this, I do remember the speech that was made that day, and I remember the song that I really internalized, I think, for the first time. I'd heard it before because it was a Bob Dylan song. It resonated on this particular day. What happened was Peter, Paul, and Mary sang "Blowin' in the Wind." I can recall at the time we only had black and white TV. I can recall watching on our television set, maybe during Walter Cronkite or whatever, but I got turned on to the news and a rebroadcast, because you see, at the time, there was nothing like today. Nothing was instantaneous. People had to go out and take film and then send it back and have the film prepared for broadcast, for video broadcast. So it was a very cumbersome process. So there were no live events. I don't remember any reporters, but I do remember the crowds, because the crowds were gathered in the backdrop of the Washington Monument. They were walking on Pennsylvania Avenue, down Washington Avenue, and toward the Lincoln Memorial. I do remember that. And it's also true and relevant to this conversation to explain something. Some might listen to what I'm about to read to you, which are the first 29 lines of this speech. Some might choose to think what I'm talking about has a racial overtone. And certainly it does, because the speech was about civil rights and jobs. But it has a broader implication, I think, in today's time. But nonetheless, it's one of the first times that I can honestly remember when I became conscious of the American caste system, which has been so eloquently portrayed in Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste. And because I grew up in a small town a border town in Washington called Bellingham, and there were no black students in my class. I can't remember running into black people in the downtown area. So I was clearly raised in a white culture, a similar to me culture. That happened in many places in America at that time. So I was insulated from places in America that weren't like the place I was living in. And the place I was living in had no reason or opportunity to address the issue that was being raised on this day, on August 28, 1963. Having said all that, I think the most important thing that I wanted to accomplish is this. The speech began, it only lasted, I believe, about 17 minutes, and Martin Luther King was introduced. He started on the prepared speech. About 11 minutes into the speech, he paused. And then, of course, he began his iconic add-on, the impromptu. He looked up, and history has it that Mahalia Jackson, who was nearby, spoke out and said, "Martin, tell him about the dream." And so Dr. King absorbed that, looked up, and began his iconic line, "I have a dream." Now, most of you listening to this have heard about that speech. Some oldies like me can remember the context of the times. Most of you can't. But it's an important echo from the past that needs to resonate into the future. And more importantly, there's a universal part of that message that I think is very relevant today. And that are the first 29 lines in that speech. And that's what I'm going to read you now, is the first 29 lines. And it is my hope that no matter what your ideological framework is, what your moral code is, what your North Star is, you will find these words particularly important and resonant now with everything that's going on in America today. And from the bottom of my heart, I hope you share this conversation. I hope you can share it because other people can rehear or listen for the first time to the first 29 lines of that speech. They're not the most famous. They're not the most quoted, but they're cornerstone to what democracy is about. And they're cornerstone to the idea that democracy depends on conversation and listening and sharing. And as a storyteller, on this day, on August 28th, this is the story that I want to share with you. As always, thank you very much for your time. I greatly appreciate it, and please tune in to the next few minutes. Thank you. So now it's about 3:05 or 6 in the afternoon on August 28th, 1963. And Martin Luther King begins. 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon of light, of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note, insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. We refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all God's children. It would be fatal for this nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. For those who hoped that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content, will have a rude awakening if this nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But there is something that I must say to my people who stand on this warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our peaceful and rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the highest plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many, our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied with our destiny. And they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone, and as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. And at that moment in the speech, Dr. King looks up and he pauses. And when he returns to the iconic portion of the speech that everyone remembers on this day. But I thought these last 29 lines were of utmost relevance to all of us on this day. And I'll leave you with, I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.